welcome everyone to the Project on Civil Discourses Summer Series on communication across distance. My name is Lara Schwartz and I am the director of the Project on Civil Discourse. I'm very grateful to Isabella Dominique, who is an FPA 2020 grad and the outgoing coordinator of our program, for leading our conversation today on activism, as well as Daniel Leon-Davis, who was one of my first students at AU and does stuff, more to come, and Imani Vice and Joshua Dantzler, who are current AU students. I'm going to fade into the background, but I'm just going to give a quick intro about some process stuff. So first of all, for accessibility purposes, if you need for this conversation to have captioning, our captioner information is, if you go to the chat function, you can see the link where the captioning has happened. If you come back to this video later, this is being recorded, and you choose to share it with friends or use it for your classes or whatever you might do, it will be closed captioned when it goes live, so it will be fully accessible. The chat function is going to be enabled throughout, so you can get the conversation going and engage with our great panelists and activists. We want this to be an interactive conversation. Isabella will take it away soon, and the idea is to spend a bit of time communicating with the people you see on the screen and open it up as well to all of the participants who are with us for a real robust conversation with everyone jumping in, because activism is active. And that's about all for me, and welcome, Isabella.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I'm working back with the PCD. It's only been like a month, I feel like, since I've been gone, but I'm excited to be back. And with me, I have our, co-host, special guest, Daniel Leon-Davis, who's also going to provide a brief introduction of who he is and the work he does.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I love AU, and so I'm always happy to be invited back into these conversations. So to give you a little context of who I am and what I do, I actually start with the fact that I was undocumented in this country for 19 years. Like so many other dreamers before me, I actually found out during my senior year of college, of high school, that I was undocumented. And as you can imagine, as someone who grew up here since he was 6, to that point, realizing that even though I woke up every day, went to school, put my hand on my chest, and pledge allegiance to the flag that everyone else did, I actually wasn't as American as I thought I was, simply because of access to papers. And so I ended up taking a gap year. It was way before it was cool, not even cool, way before I was brave enough to even say publicly that I was undocumented at the time. And in that gap year, got connected to some folks and was able to attend a community college. That is actually where my activism started. Finding out I was undocumented politicized me in a way that I never thought I would be politicized. I ended up during my freshman year of college doing a program called Clinton Global Initiative University that was run by the Clinton Foundation, where I actually learned what it meant to activate as a young leader. And through that was connected to a fellowship called Young People For, where I was taught about community organizing, and took that back home to my home state of Florida, where I was doing community college at. Fast forward a couple of years, I ended up transferring to American University. As part of that, one of my first classes I had was with the late Professor Julian Bond, who was one of Dr. King's students, was also one of the co-founders of SNCC during the Civil Rights era, and frankly, just got super, super, super activated at AU. I decided to come out as undocumented at AU, organized around racial justice, obviously immigration, as well as environmental justice. And for me, being an activist has always, since that moment of finding out I was undocumented, has always been a big part of my life. And so when it came to deciding what I was going to do for life, I knew that I was also really into art, really into media, and I wanted to find a way to intersect all of them. This was before also social media was as big as it is now. But for me in that journey, one of the things I actually just found, I just moved to Atlanta, but I found the paper that I wrote for one of my classes on the power that MTV had in implementing a program internationally around getting tested for HIV, and how much media they used, how much like basically shows and content they created around that, which was the beginning of me being able to realize that there was actually a space for me to intersect everything that I loved. And so after graduating from American University, I moved to New York, and within the year, co-founded a social impact creative agency called the Soze Agency, which basically does work at the intersection of art, media, entertainment, and social impact. And through that, what I've gotten to do as the creative director, I'm no longer there, but what I got to do for 6 years as the creative director was actually not just build video content that obviously works a lot during quarantine, but we were actually building spaces. We were building pop-up museums to talk about the impact of the fashion industry on the environment, or building events talking about voting rights and the need for us to actually look at things through a different lens using art, right? And so through all of that, really the intersection for me has been, how do you create media? How do you create art? How do you activate people who have social power, right? That be it celebrity, influencer, whatever the case might be, around a social issue. One of the biggest campaigns I remember is actually a campaign called No Such Thing. Basically, it was a campaign that was centered on the fact that there is no such thing as a child prostitute. And yet every single time you turn the news on, people were using that terminology. And so we actually went after the AP Style Guide. It took us a good year. We activated everyone from P. Diddy to Rosario Dawson. And the AP Style Guide came out to us and they were like, we're not gonna change this. This doesn't make sense. Stop bothering us, stop attacking us. And then the next year they dropped the style guide and literally the language was exactly what we had written for them. And so a lot of that was just the power of social media and the power of art. Now I'm the creative director of the I Stand With Immigrants campaign, which is centered around uplifting the narratives of immigrants in this country. I'm also now a US citizen, so get to say a little bit crazier things without being worried about who's gonna come knocking at my door. But through that work, it's been now 7 years of doing this campaign. Through that work, it's all narrative change based. And really the focus has been the same thing I've been talking about, utilizing art, media, and entertainment. And so today we launched a video with the likes of Aloe Black. We've had everyone from French Montana, Miguel, Rosario Dawson, Kerry Washington involved in these campaigns. And I'm really just intrigued by the use of social power for that. And that's why I'm excited to be part of this conversation. I also had Professor Schwartz, as she mentioned, during what I believe was her first undergraduate class at AU. And we've stayed connected since then. So just happy to be here with you all.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that was a really cool story. I feel like my bio is probably 10% of the excitement.
Nah, don't downplay it like that.
So yeah, I'll provide a little bit about myself and I guess my interest in this topic. So like Professor Schwartz was saying, I just graduated from AU a month ago in May. And during my time at AU, I think is also where I definitely got radicalized in different forms of activism and advocacy, and I guess just the different pathways you can take as a student. So I was initially involved in a program called DC Reads that we have at AU, which basically opened my eyes to a lot of the injustices that exist in DC with the education system. And I think seeing how the DC area impacts a lot of the Black and Brown students that grow up there was definitely different from where I grew up, which is suburban Colorado and probably 98% white. And so it was definitely really interesting to see just how inequities can be different across different education spaces. And from there, I got involved with our campus's NAACP, and eventually became the president of that chapter. And then also, founded and created our AU Black Caucus Committee, which is essentially like an overarching organization of all the Black organizations that exist at AU, just because I think we have, I don't know, like 17 or 18 now, which is quite a bit for PWI. And so we essentially needed a way to come together and organize, and I think sort of like prove our legitimacy as Black students who need things to administrators. So I did that, and then I also served as our student liaison to the Black Alumni Alliance as well. And I think during my time at AU, it was interesting because I did a lot of work with like policy and advocacy and like just doing general NAACP things, which are a lot more like behind the scenes activism work. And then since being home in Denver, just after COVID-19 happened, and everyone got kind of set back, and especially now with the protests going on, it's been a very different change in my activism, and I've been leading a lot of the protests here in Denver. So it's interesting, like seeing a different side of, I guess, which activism type I prefer, because I definitely used to think it was like just advocacy and like doing policy, and like meeting with administrators and doing that kind of behind the scenes work. But I'm kind of exploring a different side of that now. So stay tuned. And then we are also joined by two current students, Imani Vice and Joshua Dantzler. And Imani, I'll have you introduce yourself as well. But Imani is currently a rising junior, and she is taking over my position as the Black Caucus Committee chair. So I'm very excited to have her on. And Joshua is a rising senior, and he's done a lot of work with AU Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and is also a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Imani, do you want to go ahead and just start with maybe a brief introduction?
Yes, I'm really excited to be here. As Isabella alluded to, I am currently the interim chair for the Black Caucus Committee at AU. I'm also the director of community engagement with AUSG. So I'm excited to kind of fill that advocacy role and kind of tie in, making sure that all voices are heard on a student activist level, so that it's, you know, just very inclusive to everyone. I'm also a DC Reads team leader. So as Isabella also alluded to, it gives me the opportunity to see not only where I'm from, Baltimore, Maryland, where we have a lot of educational disparities, but also in DC, just seeing how in our nation's capital, we have all these different socioeconomic disparities, educational disparities, and just how they exist when we're in such a profitable and economically flourishing community such as AU. So just seeing how we have certain things that, just certain issues that are going on, how we can eradicate those disparities. That's definitely something that I've been very fortunate to definitely delve in through policy here in Baltimore, working with how to reform the education system, specifically the public school system in Baltimore, trying to see if there's more of a vocational understanding, reaching the needs, reforming the education system to actually make sure that the students are thought of, not more so just the economy, but looking at students more so as individuals and not just statistics and numbers. So that inspiration that I had was delving into in high school definitely led into a lot of the activism that I'm doing currently in DC with DC Reads, and as well with just interactions with administrators and just how AU's role goes into this system of education disparities. How do we use that in our voices in that sense? So yeah, that's a little bit about me in different ways, very condensed, but yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And then Joshua, do you want to go ahead and share more about yourself too?
Yes, Joshua Dantzler, he, him, his pronouns. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all who are tuning in and for being here. Like I said, like Isabella said, I am a rising fourth-year student, senior at American University, studying political science with a minor in communication. And I say communication because with my activism and with my start to activism in high school, I've always been interested in how we communicate activism. How do we communicate what's going on? How do we communicate those injustices? How do we communicate the movement? How do we engage folks? And so I became I became an active in activism in high school. Really, when I started understanding the Black Lives Matter movement, when I started realizing the continuation of police brutality, not just on older Black folk, but also young Black folk. And so when I began to see myself as a Trayvon Martin or as a Imani Vice, I began to say, hey, I can't just sit here. I can't just sit back. I have to fight for those Black men, those Black women, those Black individuals who are my age, who could be my age, and who fell victim or who fell short due to police brutality. So I began my activism in high school. And then in college, I began to study, again, just how communication plays into activism, how we communicate, how do we look at movements, how do we analyze movements. And so, you know, in college, I've taken more of a educator role, learning about activism more, but still having it at the forefront of my life. So forefront in terms of just, you know, campus initiatives and policies and the offices that I've held and the positions I've held in with my fraternity, and how, you know, as an activist, how can I then thus educate others while also still being at the front line, but also thinking about largely how do we communicate activism? How do we tell the story? The stories often repeat themselves, and what story are we telling? What story are we elevating, amplifying, and also how are we making sure that we're telling the right story with activism, for sure. So that's my spiel a little bit, but I'm happy to be here, happy to engage in conversation, and again, thankful for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go ahead and kick it off with our first question, which is directed toward Daniel. And I guess I'm wondering what kind of advice you might have to students on activism within PWIs, and what that looks like, especially just given current events and sort of what's going on now with the world and what that looks like, I guess, sort of as a microcosm on a PWI.
Yeah, no, of course, of course. I also, before I answer this question, I want to flag that every PWI is not the same. Right? Like, I think that, and even AU has its own problems, to be very frank, and I think everyone in this conversation would agree. But I think that I've had friends who've gone to PWIs where they are literally like one of like 3 people of color on the entire campus, right? And I think that what's really interesting about being in that space, and particularly being in like a school that's like a liberal arts school, right, is also how you think about organizing. Most times when you're thinking about organizing, you're thinking about organizing your own community, right? So think about, like, for me with immigration, or just even things that were going on campus in regards to racial justice that was going on while I was there, right? Like, you're organizing around like Black and brown people together, and you're like, all right, let's build community and let's use our collective power. I think what's interesting with the PWI is like actually having to have that conversation around allies in a way that you don't have it in other spaces, right? In a way where sometimes you actually have to organize with the ally as like a primary actor, only because you need to be able to leverage their power. And I felt that that's what I had to do, even being at AU, right? Like, even though I had this cohort of dope, young Black and brown people, we were such a small number in comparison to, like, frankly, the white people on campus, right? That you really had to organize around the conversation around allyship and how that shows up. And so I think about that often because it sort of has led me, and it sounds like, I mean, we're all obviously doing activism work, which is dope, and being on campus and being in different stages. But for me, it was interesting because I didn't see that translate until maybe a couple years ago, where I realized that, like, yo, I can organize as much as I want around immigrants, right? And just like be like, immigrants, we're empowered, blah, blah, blah. And then having to realize that this campaign that we launched called IAmAnImmigrant, one of the biggest things that we got from people was like, all right, but I'm not an immigrant, but I support immigrants, right? And so we actually shifted the entire campaign to be called I Stand With Immigrants. And the big piece of that is actually, like, when we did our planning for this year, we were like, yo, our primary audience is not preaching to the choir of immigrants that we know also need support, also need work. But in order to change the things we want to change, we have to go for allies. I think the other thing I'll add around organizing on a PWI is, like, what does the administration look like? You know what I mean? Because I think that for us, for me personally, it was important to have Black and brown administrators that I could go to and be like, y'all, this is some messed up shit going on. And like, how do I even go around trying to get into the rooms I need to get into? And more often than not, it was them who were actually bringing me into the spaces, making sure that I got the meetings when I was trying to organize around administrators. So I think that that's a really, really big part. I'm interested to hear sort of the current students, like what it's like for you all organizing on campus.
I think you really touched on something that I hadn't thought about in preparing for this, but the definite need to identify allies. And as you said, you know, we're surrounded as Black and brown students on these PWI campuses. We are surrounded by a lot of, you know, like-minded individuals, a lot of dope individuals, folks who, you know, are our brothers and sisters in this fight. But, you know, because of the positions and the population, we have to identify those allies, because, you know, the voices of sometimes the voices of a lot are louder than the voices of a few. And so making sure that, like, when we are engaging with allies, so it's a lot, right? So it's twofold. It's one, making sure we're identifying the allies, but it's also making sure that we're educating the allies so that they can stand properly with us. And that with is something so crucial, because I often tell folks is that I don't need allies to stand in front of me. I don't need allies to stand behind me. I need allies to stand with me. And so when you're standing with me, you're saying that, hey, I'm not going to overpower you. I'm not going to, you know, outshine you. I'm not going to outtalk you. And when you're behind me, you're not saying that I'm just going to make you do all the work. I'm not, like, when you're behind me, you're not just pushing me up, but rather you're with me saying, hey, if your voice gets tired a little bit, I have the knowledge and I have the experience that you've taught me to articulate your experience, articulate your struggle in a way that's not compromising those things or compounding them, but it's standing with. And so I think it's really crucial. And it's every issue, right? Every issue, you don't have the same allies. There's not the same allies for every issue. And there's not, and I think allyship, you know, every ally isn't as vocal as the next, right? So it's knowing that, you know, if we're standing in the line for this issue, if we're standing in line for an issue on campus, say food insecurity, right? Not everyone's gonna be as vocal about food insecurity, but I still need my allies to talk about it, because Black and brown students are affected by food insecurity disproportionately than other students. So it's really trying to identify who can be the allies, and sometimes those who, you know, those allies also have connections to, again, those administrators. And identifying those key administrators are very crucial, especially in trying to get long-lasting change on campus.
Yeah, Joshua, you definitely hit it on the head. I just want to highlight and elaborate on something you said when it comes to allyship, because I went to a PWI for high school, and obviously we've always had, you know, racial issues that as Black students we were just aware of, and we were working towards, and we were fighting towards it. And a lot of people weren't necessarily engaged. They didn't have this devotion towards the things that we were fighting for. So I kind of had a negative view of allyship, of more so like, okay, this is my fight, I'm gonna just keep it moving. I know it firsthand, so I'm just gonna, you know, push through it, fight. And it wasn't until coming to AU, but specifically this year and in this specific, I guess, the time that we're in right now, with everything that's going on with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, and we're seeing the incoming pouring of support, where I really highlight the importance of allyship, just because of what Joshua said. I am tired, you know, like I've been fighting for these things since I was in middle school, you know, like using my voice, since I was just made aware of this situation as a Black woman of racism and how I'm perceived in America. So just understanding that this has been an ongoing situation, whether we vocally talk about it or not, it's an issue that I have to deal with. So because I'm tired, I couldn't even look at the video of George Floyd, but when I saw the outpour, I didn't have any words. I didn't have anything to fight. I didn't. I was tired. So when I saw all of these allies coming out, I was just like, I was very grateful in a sense, because I couldn't give any more at that moment. It was just such sadness and just disparity at that point, where I was just like, I you have to do it. You have to take this on for me right now because I have very little to give at this moment. So I think the importance of allyship is understanding that, yeah, I won't really understand fully the depth of your pain, but I'm gonna carry it for you when you can't carry it. And it's not a sense of like, oh, I'm saving you or anything like that. I don't want it to be a savior like concept or anything like that, but it's more so I'm sympathetic to the, not pitying, but I'm sympathetic, not empathetic, because you can't really understand, as my experience as a Black woman, not being a Black person or a Black woman, but I understand that I won't understand, but I have to keep fighting for you. You know, with you, I'm fighting with you. And I think that aspect of fighting for me is fighting with me in some instances. So I think that instance of allyship with, you know, carrying it when I can't carry it, because it takes a toll on you, especially when you've been fighting this for so long. So I think, Joshua, you definitely hit the importance of when my voice is tired, because I've been screaming for years. I've been talking for years. So at this moment, like, you know, I think that this right now, essentially for me, highlights the importance of allyship, something that I never really understood until I was like, oh, I have nothing else to give. So yeah, I think you definitely hit it on the head with the importance of allyship.
I think too, sort of as a, I guess, concluding note on that question, I think you both really articulated that really well. And it makes me very happy that AU is being left in the hands of you two and a lot of your peers. And I think another key point about allyship that I've noticed, especially in the Denver protests, where Denver is majority white and our protests are majority white, especially about a Black issue, is that I hope that those that label themselves as an ally don't put themselves in a situation where they may be a burden on their Black peers, because that's a lot of what I'm experiencing here in Denver, where it's just, you know, Colorado is very friendly. It's a lot of very friendly white liberals who live here, and that's great, but it's a lot of people who I think are well-intentioned, but actually do a lot of harm still, even if they want to label themselves as an ally. And it's real exhausting to be fighting like white supremacy and like the police, and then also be looking at people in the crowd like, did y'all really just say that? You know, it's like a double battle. And I feel like in order to label yourself as an ally, you really need to be mindful of the words you're using and mindful of the actions you have. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's just kind of like a concluding thought I had about allyship on that front. So I guess continuing on with our discussion, we kind of wanted to shift the conversation over to civil discourse and what activism looks like on online platforms. So I guess like the next question too, especially for like Imani being the chair of the Black Caucus Committee, what does activism look like with the committee, especially with everything going on now, and like how are, I guess, challenges, but also, I don't know, I guess, yeah, just challenges being presented just given the online platform and having to organize our community while being pretty separated.
Yeah, this is definitely something I'm still trying to figure out, just with mobilizing through technology, which is not, it's definitely difficult, but I think that looks like just making sure you're advocating for people to take care of themselves, especially with the Black Caucus, because it's comprised of Black leadership. And as I said before, you know, Black leaders, especially on AU's campus, whenever there's an issue or when there's not an apparent issue, Black students are always fighting, especially Black leaders. So just making sure that our Black leaders are taken care of and that they're taking care of themselves, knowing that they're loved and appreciated. So it's not as if the fight is stopping and we're like, we gotta stop, you know, just everything's still moving. But I think before every meeting or whatever is going on, and during the meetings, at the end, I always try and conclude with, please take care of yourself. Please reach out if there's anything that I can help you with. Just making ourselves accessible for each other with having that conversation. I'm not okay. I don't know what's going on. I don't know how I'm feeling. So I think definitely just mobilizing starts with how are you doing? How are you feeling? Taking care of each other. And I think also just being very flexible in a sense, like, you know, Zoom fatigue is real. So, you know, always on Zoom, long time. So just trying to be very flexible with the situations you're given. So yeah, Zoom fatigue, that's something that I'm always working with. Non-response just because different time zones. So that's always just, it just seems like the issues and the inconveniences never seem to stop. But I think it really comes down to the passion. It's never, no one's really ever let me down. I know that some people may not respond. I'm like, why aren't people responding? But it comes to when work needs to be done, when things need to happen, people are very passionate about the things that we're fighting for. So it comes down to people just being there, just taking their time, taking their space, and just me as a leader in this position, just acknowledging, hey, you take your space. I have full faith in you to come through when you need to come through. And if you can't come through, that's okay, because you're taking care of yourself. So I think just flexibility and really just like reading the room in a sense, like kind of understanding, just, you know, just going with, I think I can't really give a formula to it, but more so just acknowledging what's going on, reading the space and moving, being flexible in that sense, if that makes sense.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I think Imani brought up a really great point about self-care and what taking care of ourselves as activists look like. So Daniel and Josh, if you guys also want to maybe elaborate on what that looks like within the movement, and also maybe how to like separate yourself, not from the movement, but to take time away while not completely detaching.
All right, I'll go first. So I find this like really interesting in regards to like where we're at in this time. I think for me, I mean, Zoom fatigue is like super, super real. I don't know what it is about Zoom. It just takes so much more energy than being in person with people. And I think part of it is like, you can be in person with people and just be like quiet, but you're sharing space. Whereas like on Zoom, you're just like looking at people like, all right, so who's gonna talk? Cause like it shouldn't be silent, right? I think organizing for me is like really interesting because something that you all brought up earlier was like basically moving through those stages of what organizing can look like for you, right? Like I think people, and particularly the media, like is like, all right, the activist is the person who is out on the street, making the demand, so on and so forth, not realizing that movements, and not just movements of now, but movements of forever, have actually been so broad. And that was a really big piece for me because even though I was trained in community organizing, even though I was the kid who showed up to American because they were so good about undocumented students, and then lo and behold, I get there and kind of it was BS, right? And I'm the one that's like willing to call them out on it. My passion is actually in art, media, and entertainment, right? Like my passion is in using those tools. And so what I found interesting in all of this is like, also what's your place in the movement? Everyone's place, and even when you defined your place, it doesn't have to be the same all the time, right? And so for me, I know that like activating artists is probably my favorite thing to do in movement, right? Like when something happens, I am the person who wants to be on the phone with an artist being like, yo, what can we create right now to get people to understand, to see this, right? And so I think I used to feel a lot of shame when I started realizing that that was like my superpower, because I was like, oh no, but I have to be like demanding this on the street all the time, or I have to be doing X, Y, Z. And so in the time of social distancing, I think what's been interesting for me was, one, I've been running social media campaigns and things regarding social media for 7 years now, right? So that feels really normal to me. And a lot of our movements of now, I feel, have been activated through that. But I think in regards to connecting with folks, I do a lot more one-on-one checking in than I've ever done before, because I realize like what you get in a group setting in person is you're somehow able to build those individual connections while still being in a group. Whereas like on Zoom, like you're not really getting that, you're not really sharing that all the time. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but I feel like a lot more of my time has actually been taking up calling people one by one and being like, yo, let's talk about the strategy for this thing that we want to move, or hey, let's talk about this piece. And not always on video either. Like, frankly, like sometimes I just want to not see your face. And so I think being really transparent about that, right? And that's what I love about like our generations, right? Is that like, we're pretty transparent. We'll tell you how it is. And that's a really, really big piece of all of this. So yeah, I'm going to pass it over to Joshua.
As always, I feel like I'm just surrounded by greatness on this panel because every point I want to make or everything I want to say is already said. And so I won't be that guy to like piggyback off, or like I won't be like to rehash. No, but I just want to say, I guess to, you know, address like the self-care piece, Isabella, is just to really, I found myself, and it's hard, right? Because social media is, and I don't know if we talk about this or not, but social media is such a great educator about a lot of this stuff. And I'm being educated, and then I'm educating other folks and resharing. And so I'm on it all the time, but also knowing that with this movement, that it can be so, um, so consuming and overwhelming that you sometimes have to take a step back. So with self-care in this movement for me is that I turn my notifications off. So I'm still on, you know, the apps, I'm still on Twitter, I'm still on Instagram, but I'm not notified when something happens. So I have to personally notify myself to thus then get on. And so, you know, I'm not saying to get off social media, but for me, self-care is saying that, hey, I'm not having the pressure necessarily to check the application because I'm not notified, but I'm still being on, I'm still being informed, I'm still being engaged. And then it's taking time to be outside. I feel like I have been outside the most than I've ever been in my recent couple of months and recent years. And I'm like, I'm getting my physical fitness in, I'm walking, or I'm taking a phone call and I'm walking outside, you know, checking in with people. I'm riding my bike, I'm listening to music, I'm listening to my Black Lives Matter playlist, and I'm like getting empowered through my like bike ride, you know. So finding little pockets of the day at least to, you know, not engage with the work directly, because if you and finding that rest, because if you're on 7 days, 6 days out of the 7 days of the week, you really cannot be energized as you should be, or this movement requires you to be. And if that's the goal, if the goal is to be energized, if the goal is to be fully present, then you have to allow yourself to be present by yourself before you can be present amongst other folks. And so I definitely have like found that as like a little, you know, as a little respite to the movement, because the movement is continuous. And we've been out protesting for 3 weeks, you know, for days on end. And so how do you find yourself the option, the opportunity to, you know, recharge and to replenish yourself so that you can come back into the movement even bigger and better?
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll definitely be taking your advice on self-care, especially from the movement. So I guess the final question that I have for everybody before we open it up to audience questions, which for the audience, if you'd like to prepare yourself to ask a question, you can just unmute yourself and do so, or put it in the chat if you'd rather not expose yourself by unmuting yourself. But the last question I had was, I guess just in regards to, again, also educating people about like race relations and everything going on in America right now, and maybe just other different activism points that are happening. What does a productive conversation look like to you?
Well, I want to add something to the previous question real quick, or the previous, one of the things I see online a lot is like, I'm not going to rest. And I think like a lot of, particularly the last 10 years of movement learned was that is not it. And that is some white supremacist thinking that they want you to be like, you're not going to rest. You're just going to keep going until we win this fight. Because the reality is like, this is a long-term fight. And even people who started a lot of these movements, Patrisse Cullors talks about this all the time, about how much you have to take care of yourself. So I just want to reemphasize that, because that's so important. And I know so many people who have burned out, and like they burn out and never come back. Never come back. They're like, I'm good. I'm scarred, rather than like sort of this like rejuvenation that Joshua was talking about and Imani were talking about. In regards to productive conversations, I actually just had an interview where I was talking about this, because my biggest thing is proximity. Brian Stevenson talks about this concept of proximity, right? And actually like knowing someone. For me, I grew up in Florida, super purple state, right? Did not talk about politics, was not talked about politics at home, other than about immigration really, but didn't understand that people had like not bad viewpoints, but like different viewpoints that were actually harmful towards me, which I guess is bad. If your viewpoints harm my body or harm my community in a violent way, it's bad. So my biggest thing was I was definitely like the kid who changed a lot of people's minds simply because they were like, wait, but there's no way you're an immigrant. So when I came out, it was a really big thing to a lot of like people I would end up finding out were like super Republican, right? Back home in Florida, because they would be like, no, but I've known you your whole life. You've been here. What are you talking about? And it's this very, frankly, like white supremacist, like, but you speak really well. You're a straight A student. You're a good immigrant. There's no way you're like them, right? But I think it's that, and that's what I've used a lot in all of my conversations, is like there's this proximity. And proximity doesn't, let's be very clear, right? Proximity does not mean, oh, I have a Black friend, I know what this is, you know what I mean? Like it actually means having someone who you're able to, who you care for, who you love, but who you also understand and seek to understand. And that also doesn't mean, I think Joshua or Imani, no, Joshua, you mentioned it earlier, you know, part of like being an ally is also being educated by us. But there's also some of us that don't want to educate some folks. And that's okay. And I think that's what it goes back to, again, realizing like there's just different people in different parts of the movement and in different parts of this journey. And so for me, a productive conversation is, look, I'm down to I've had conversations about gun rights with folks who are like literally carrying AR-15s like across their chest, and we're like face to face, and had an hour-long conversation that led to them then like protecting the group I was with, right? And so I think that the piece is like, how are you showing up in the conversation? And that's also how I try to think about it. But as soon as like this becomes about harm in any way, I'm out. So, but I know some people who have a lot, who are willing to have a lot deeper conversations with people who I'm just like, I'm good. So, you know, it's also about protecting yourself in a lot of ways.
For sure. Awesome. Josh and Imani, did you want to add to that quickly before we move over to questions?
Just listen. I think that's, for me, productive conversations require, you know, listening and listening intently. And, you know, if you want to have a conversation with me, I would expect you to like listen to what I'm sharing with you. Don't take it as Bible, because it's just my perspective and my viewpoint, right? You know, Black folks, organizers, brown folks, we're not a monolith. So don't just take my word as is, but just listen to what I have to say. And, you know, don't necessarily have to tell me sorry, but show your actions through your message. You don't have to apologize to me, or don't continue to say sorry, because as I was told growing up, sorry doesn't change things sometimes, you know, so show me your actions and let your actions speak louder than your words.
Right.
But that's all I had to add.
Yeah, I don't really have, I think they just hit it on the head. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, cool. I'll just go ahead and quickly answer this question that's in the chat. I think everyone has access to see it. But it says, I'd be curious to hear more from Isabella about the harm she sees so-called allies doing in Denver or elsewhere. So yeah, Denver, just for some very brief context, is really going through it. I don't know what's happening, but it's a lot of like co-optation that's going on in the movement. And it was really scary to see all of that go on about like 2 weeks ago. And that's kind of what pushed me to like sort of like stand up against that, just because I was not going to sit at home and ignore it. And I certainly wasn't going to participate in like All Lives Matter protests, which is essentially what's going on in Denver. And a lot of it was being, for context, was led by like some Black men and obviously white people in Denver who are kind of like malleable in terms of like race conversations and like thoughts about race, especially when there's a Black person telling you how to think. It was just like a crazy situation. And so basically, like, let's see, I think it was this last Friday, we did a march to the Denver DA's house, and there was a man who, he was young, he was like 21, he was my age, and he was murdered by the police last August. And people have been like sharing like photos and videos of him. He like used to play like violin to cats and like humane societies and stuff like that, which is really adorable. And like, I think people are doing a lot more work to prove that like Elijah McClain was a human who was like worthy of not being killed by the police. And so like a lot of that messaging was coming from like people like, oh, look at how sweet he was, like that's the cutest thing, like he was so adorable for playing violin to the cats. And like to me, I don't think that like any person should have to prove their humanity or their worth, especially when it comes to being murdered from the police or murdered by the police. And so it's just sort of like that language that I think we're ingrained to use, especially in a country where there's sort of like a white default in a lot of the ways we communicate. And I think too, like even some of the pushback I've received from the way I've communicated with like protesters or people in Denver, like there's a lot of white people who will say like, oh, like you need to make it so that your words are like less divisive, or like you should communicate in XYZ way. And I actually don't think I need to change how I'm communicating, especially when I'm feeling anger and rage and grief all in one moment and still trying to like improve the country. Like that's a lot of emotional burden, and I don't think it's on me as a Black woman to take that on and change the way I communicate. Instead, I think, as Joshua was saying, people should just listen and not so much be offended by what I have to say, but understand why those words are coming out of my mouth the way that they are. And I think, you know, when you tell Black people like, oh, white people are more apt to listen to you if you communicate in XYZ way, like you're just invalidating our experiences. Because quite honestly, the way I'm communicating is the way I'm communicating because I'm angry and I'm sad and I'm upset. Also because a lot of the people in Denver just simply weren't doing this work like a month ago. Whereas like we've been doing this work for years. So it's just absolutely not your place to tell me how I should be communicating with you. And so that's kind of like the allyship that we see in Denver. And I think a lot of that just sort of speaks to the white default that we have here in America, where everything needs to be palatable to white folks in order for it to change. So I hope that answers your question, Catherine. Let's see. These are kind of like long questions. Does anyone have a question they wanted to ask, like unmute while I read through some of these?
I'm curious for, I'm looking at some of the participants. There's a generational difference, I think, in the way that people see communication and activism. And I think that both the generation of which the four of you are more apart and are both more comfortable in activist spaces often than older people, and then as well more comfortable in online spaces than older people. And so, you know, I think these are questions about allyship or, you know, have come into the mix, but what are people, a lot of the people running the institutions that will really affect you, like whether it's American University, other universities, employers, are going to come from an older generation. They're going to be Gen X like me or boomers or whatever. Older millennials like Daniel, I think, is a younger millennial. What do they and we have just wrong about ultimately the people who are the voice of the next generation of leadership, which is all of you, and how do they have to listen, basically?
I can't talk about exactly who it is yet because there's some organizing going on. But I think that what people are having to realize is like, your constituents are us, right? And so I think there was a very accepted, like, not very accepted, right? It's not like this is the first time that there's activism, right? But there were norms, right? Particularly in academic institutions, in foundations, in nonprofits that were very like, look, these are the people making the rules. It's okay, they know best. We put them in power. They're the people we trust. without it being questioned, right? And I felt like that happened a lot. And even when I was younger, I felt like that happened a lot. And I think what particularly, and I am a millennial, but I'm like trying to not curse, but what I freaking love about Gen Z is like, and I feel like our generation also started it, was like, we're gonna question everything. We wanna see everything. We want you to be transparent about everything. And so I think what's catching people off guard, particularly people who are leading these organizations or institutions, whatever the case might be, is that they're used to being in a position of power where they're no longer questioned, right? Where they're almost, it was almost designed as if they were the parent, right? The parent who's like, no, don't ask me, I know best, it's all good, right? And now we're in this position where it's like, you can know more because you actually have XYZ level of experience and you have all this stuff, but we're gonna require you to be transparent. And I think that transparency is really what's messing up a lot of people right now, because people aren't used to being held to that level of accountability. And what that forces is like people realizing like, look, transparency is so needed at this point, because the less transparent you are, the more we're gonna question you, right? And so when you look at all the companies that came out 2 weeks ago and were like, hey, by the way, Black Lives Matter, hey, we love, you know what I mean? The people who've gotten attention are the people who were like, hey, by the way, so 1, we believe Black Lives Matter. 2, here's the reporting of all of the data from our leadership, our senior leadership, in regards to people of color and women represented at this company. Hey, we're not doing a good enough job. And we're gonna do better, and this is what the plan looks like publicly. And I think so many people have this like behind the closed doors ideology on like what power should look like, that Gen Z and millennials are like, actually, no, that door should be a glass door. You can hold the power because we actually decided that you were gonna hold that power. You were responsible enough to hold that power. But as a community, we just wanna check in on you and see. So I think that that's what's really interesting about now, and sort of that generational difference is like, frankly, the ask for transparency. And not just from these like nonprofits and whatever, but like from companies, from corporations.
Looks like there's a question. Oh, sorry. Looks like
Oh,
there's
no.
about modalities of connecting to.
Imani, did you have something to add before we jump into the next question by Professor?
Yeah, really briefly, I was just gonna say, I think also when it comes to older generations, as the allusion or the kind of comparison to parents and children, I think it's kind of like, oh, well, I know best, definitely that hush hush, but it's also an invalidation of how we express certain things. So I think just because we aren't going along with how your parents did it or how you all did it, doesn't necessarily mean that you can invalidate how we express our voices. So I think just that listening aspect and not the invalidation because we aren't going with your social codes or how you thought it was deemed acceptable. So also I think that listening is okay even as an elder, like listening to people who are younger than you, that is also a respectable trait. It's not necessarily taking away your honor, taking away the power that you have. I think it's even more honorable to put yourself in a position to learn from people younger than you. So yeah, I think that aspect of, yes, you can hold that power, but you can also listen. You can also not invalidate what I have to say or my existence. So allow me to express and grieve and just be how I want to be in this moment authentically without you having to kind of like maneuver or alter the situation just because it's different from how you all did that process. So that's just my 2 cents. But
that was a nice 2 cents. I really felt that. Professor Schwartz, what was the question you were going to ask?
There was a question in the chat about modalities. We're here together today on Zoom, and I know that a lot of people are looking for other ways to be connected. And one of our attendees raised that same point. How do we connect and socially distance outside of this modality?
Raise your hand if you've been added to more group chats since social distancing started. Literally, I use group chats personally. I mean, I've been on group chats for forever, but I use group chats as like an organizing tool. And even for work, like I've literally started moving people. And I used to be a very like phone, email, don't text me, just email me person. But realizing that it's just like easier for me to organize people. And one of the things that I realized was like I said, I get really easy Zoom fatigue. I give myself like max an hour of Zoom. Like this is my hour of Zoom today. That is it. There will be no more Zoom for the day. And so for me, it's like actually being able to text. And I know that for a lot of people that feels impersonal, but for a lot of like the communities I belong to, it's actually been a way for us to like, as soon as quarantine started, got thrown into all of these group chats where it's actually just like us checking in on each other that then led to like, oh, by the way, this is going on. How are we going to organize around this together? And sort of using that. Other than that, like I said, I do one-on-one calls, but that takes a nice chunk of time.
And I think to wrap together the Imani's wisdom and Daniel's to sort of close out our brief hour together, listening is so key. And I think this is really important for administrators, faculty, parents, teachers, leaders, people who govern. Listen to the people around you about the way that they are ready to communicate with you. So if you know that there are people you're trying to organize or teach or gather or console, whatever role you play with them, and you know that they actually are quite accessible on FaceTime or a chat and less so on other modalities, be there. It's not that hard to come and be where people are in terms of modality, just like we're all trying to practice being where people are in terms of their tone, their mood, their needs, their goals, their selves. And I think that, that's something that my students have been teaching me. So I know we're at the end of the hour and these things conclude like on a dime, but thank you to everyone, Isabella, Daniel, Imani, Joshua, amazing guests. You are great and the future feels better hearing your voices.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
For